He was the king who inherited an empire lit by the glow of 1,000 red dominions, yet lived long enough to hear the first cracks echo through its foundations. George V did not seek greatness. He did not chase power. He was a quiet man thrust into a loud throne, an ordinary soul born into extraordinary circumstance. And somehow, this quiet king became the steady heartbeat of a world collapsing into war. Revolution, an unimaginable change. From the trenches of World War I to the fall of ancient monarchies, from the rise of democracy to the birth of modern Britain, his reign stood at the crossroads of history. Behind the polished royal portraits lies a man torn between duty and family, tradition and survival, silence and responsibility. Stay with us as we uncover the forgotten story of the king who held the empire together with nothing but resolve until the very last whisper. 1. The making of a reluctant king. The story of King George V does not begin in triumph or prophecy, but in quiet insignificance and irony for a man destined to rule the largest empire the world had ever seen. Born on June 3, 1865, at Marlborough House in London, young George entered life not as the future king, but simply as the second son. His elder brother, Prince Albert, picture charming, elegant, adored, was the heir. George was the spare, almost invisible in the royal line. From childhood, he was overshadowed. Albert was the star. George was the shy, reserved boy who preferred animals to attention and duty to praise. His father, the strict and often temperamental Prince of Wales, dismissed George as slow and unimaginative. Even Queen Victoria, his formidable grandmother, considered him unremarkable. But history has a strange way of choosing its heroes. The naval prince at the age of 12, George's life took a sharp turn. Following royal tradition for spare sons, he was sent into the Royal Navy. For 14 long years, the sea shaped him. Where the court saw mediocrity, the Navy saw discipline, courage, and loyalty. George learned to wake before dawn, scrub decks, follow orders, sail across continents, and live among ordinary men whose language was coarse and whose discipline was absolute. The sea hardened him, but it also freed him. On the waves, he was not a prince. He was simply George. He traveled across the world, Australia, India, Japan, witnessing the empire's vastness with his own eyes. He saw the pride and arrogance of British rule, but he also saw the suffering, the inequality, and the tensions brewing beneath the grandeur. These were observations he would one day carry into the throne room. The heir's shadow, in contrast. His elder brother Albert Victor remained delicate, unsure, and constantly under pressure. His romantic scandals and weak constitution worried the royal household. Still, he was the heir, and George accepted his secondary role with quiet obedience. But fate was watching closely. In 1892, tragedy struck. Prince Albert Victor fell ill during a winter influenza outbreak and died at the age of 28. The shock rippled through the monarchy. Suddenly, the shy naval prince who never expected a crown became the new heir to the British Empire. The weight of destiny fell upon George with crushing force. The unexpected future. George was devastated by the loss of his brother, yet, even in mourning, the demands of monarchy did not rest. Royal advisors ensured continuity by arranging for George to marry Albert's former fiancée, Princess Mary of Teck, known as May. What began as a dutiful arrangement blossomed into one of the most stable and genuine marriages in royal history. Mary was intelligent, steady, and fiercely supportive. George, often anxious and introverted, found in her not just a partner but a compass, someone who understood the weight of responsibility better than anyone. By the end of the 1890s, George had transformed, a naval officer hardened by discipline, a husband strengthened by loyalty, an heir shaped by tragedy. The empire he would inherit. The British Empire at this time was enormous, spanning Africa, India, Canada, Australia, and parts of Asia and the Middle East. On maps, its territories were marked in red, glowing like embers. It was said the sun never set on the British Empire, but beneath the grandeur lay danger. Nationalism surged in India. Ireland demanded independence. Labor unions were rising. European powers prepared for war. To become king of such a world required not just crown and ceremony, But resilience, and George was slowly becoming the man history needed, even if he did not yet see it. The Quiet Prince faces a noisy future in 1901. Everything changed. Queen Victoria died after 63 years on the throne. George's father became King Edward VII, and George became the Prince of Wales, the direct heir to an empire in transition. He had just begun to understand what kind of king he would need to be. But destiny was not done reshaping him. Not yet. Not while the world edged closer to the greatest war mankind had ever seen. The quiet naval prince was walking toward a throne built on tradition and toward a future built on fire. To the reluctant heir to a changing world. Meal wards. When George became the Prince of Wales in 1901, the world around him was shifting faster than any British monarch or future monarchs prepared to handle. His father, King Edward VII, stepped onto the throne with the charm and charisma of a seasoned diplomat. Edward was beloved by European elites, adored by London society, and admired by foreign leaders. He was a king who understood people. George, meanwhile, understood duty. Their personalities clashed in subtle but powerful ways. Edward saw his son as stiff, overly serious, too bound by rules. George viewed his father as too relaxed, too indulgent, too trusting. The monarchy was heading into a century that demanded balance, and early on, it was clear that George and Edward represented two very different visions of kingship. A prince preparing for an empire as Prince of Wales, George was thrust into a lifestyle he neither sought nor enjoyed. Endless ceremonies, state visits, banquets, and political meetings filled his days. Unlike Edward, who thrived in the spotlight, George preferred silence to applause, routine to chaos, and family life to public adoration. But his discomfort became his greatest strength. He studied constitutional law with meticulous detail. He learned the nuances of parliamentary power. He built relationships with government leaders, diplomats, and military chiefs. He asked questions that no one expected a future king to ask. How do we keep the empire together? What happens if India demands independence? What if Ireland refuses British rule? What if Europe goes to war? These questions, once theoretical, were becoming dangerously real. The royal family in turbulent times, the early 1900s, were a golden age tinted with cracks. London sparkled with industry, fashion, and culture. Trains shrieked across the countryside. Coal fed the factories that powered half the world. The empire seemed unbeatable, but beneath the surface, tension simmered. Workers began striking for better wages. Women demanded the right to vote loudly and fearlessly. Colonies whispered about independence, and Europe's alliances tightened like fists. George watched all of it with a mind sharpened by discipline. He was not a visionary, like Elizabeth, nor a reformer like Victoria, but he understood stability better than any monarch before him. It would become the defining trait of his reign. A marriage that strengthened the crown through every challenge. George leaned heavily on one constant. His wife, Mary, intelligent, and remarkably perceptive. She managed the household, balanced public expectations, and guided George through social and political storms. Together, they raised 6 children. Edward the charming and troublesome future, Edward VIII, Albert, the stammering second son, future George VI, Mary Henry, George John. George adored his children but remained an emotionally distant father, strict, formal, often unable to express affection. The patterns of royal upbringing weighed heavily on him, and the cycle continued. His sons feared disappointing him. His daughters respected but rarely connected with him. Only Queen Mary understood him deeply. Their partnership became the backbone of the modern royal family firm, loyal and united. Shadows across Europe in the early 20th century was a pressure cooker. Monarchies ruled almost every major nation. Russia had Tsar, Nicholas II, Germany had Kaiser Wilhelm II, Austria-Hungary had Emperor Franz Joseph, and Britain had Edward VII and soon George. What made this extraordinary was that they were all related. Cousins. Bound by blood, connected by Queen Victoria's vast family tree. But family ties did not stop political storms. The rise of nationalism New technologies, rapid industrialization, and old rivalries created a landscape ready to explode. Governments stockpiled weapons. Generals drew up invasion plans. Alliances formed in secrecy. George studied all of this carefully, knowing that one spark could set the continent ablaze. Edward VII's death and George's coronation in 1910. The spark that changed George's life was not political, but personal. King Edward VII fell ill and died in May, ending a reign that was brief but adored. When George stood beside his father's coffin, watching a nation mourn a king he had spent years trying to understand, something inside him shifted. He was no longer the quiet spare, no longer the reluctant heir. He was the King of the United Kingdom and Emperor of India. His coronation that same year was filled with grandeur, but George felt the weight of something far heavier than ceremony. He was now the guardian of the empire at its peak, and the protector of the monarchy at the edge of a new century. He did not know it yet, but his reign would be defined not by peace and celebration, but by war, revolution, and the collapse of old worlds. A new king for a new era. George V stepped into the throne as the world stood at a precipice. The empire was powerful, but divided. Europe was prosperous, but fragile, and the monarchy rooted in centuries of tradition was about to face its greatest test of survival since the English Civil War. George believed his role was simple: to remain steady, even when the world is not. He was the king who would guide Britain from the Edwardian.com into the storms of modernity. He was the king who would watch cousins become enemies, and soon, far sooner than he imagined, the world would erupt into a war unlike anything humanity had ever seen. 3. The reluctant heir steps forward. George V never expected to become king so quickly. For most of his early life, he lived in the shadow of his elder brother, Prince Albert Victor, known to the family as Eddie. Eddie was the one groomed to become the future king, while George was trained more casually, with a steady but less pressured upbringing. However, things changed dramatically when Eddie died unexpectedly in 1892. The shock moved through the royal family like an earthquake. Suddenly, the quiet, disciplined second son was next in line to the throne. George's life direction shifted overnight. The man who loved the sea, the man who preferred the order of naval life over the politics of palace corridors, was suddenly pulled into the center of royal duty. George was not a natural politician. He disliked chaos, hated uncertainty, and believed deeply in routine. But after Eddie's death, he stepped into his new role with unexpected strength. Queen Victoria immediately began shaping him for kingship. She controlled everything, from his schedule to his future marriage, and she already had a bride in mind. George married Princess Mary of Teck in 1893. Interestingly, she had originally been engaged to Eddie. After Eddie's death, Queen Victoria insisted that Mary was still the right fit for the royal family. Despite the unusual beginning, George and Mary built a stable and loyal relationship. Mary's calm, intelligent presence balanced George's rigid personality, and together they formed a strong royal partnership. As Prince of Wales, George took his role seriously. He traveled throughout the empire, witnessing firsthand the vastness of British rule. India, Australia, Africa. Everywhere he went, he saw both the grandeur and the cracks forming in the imperial structure. Nationalist movements were growing, the world was changing, and George understood that the monarchy must adapt or break. He also became a symbol of stability. Britain entered the 20th century with rising tensions, labor strikes, Irish political conflicts, and constitutional crises. George believed the crown should remain neutral, calm, and steady. He disliked bold political gestures, preferring quiet influence. This conservative approach sometimes frustrated politicians, but it made him a figure the public could trust during uncertain times. When his father, King Edward VII, died in 1910, George V took the throne. He was not glamorous like his father, nor socially charming like other European kings, but he was disciplined, loyal, hardworking, and devoted to duty. He brought a seriousness back to the monarchy. George's early reign was tested almost immediately by the constitutional crisis involving the House of Lords. Asquith's liberal government wanted to limit the Lords' power, but the Lords resisted. When politics reached a breaking point, George faced a difficult choice: stay neutral or intervene. Though he hated political involvement, he agreed to create enough liberal peers to pass the Parliament Act if necessary. This quiet but decisive action helped resolve the crisis and rebalanced the British political system. But there was no time to rest. New storms were approaching, storms that would reshape the world. Across Europe, alliances tightened. Tensions rose and political assassinations signaled a dangerous shift. The old order was trembling. George V found himself at the center of a continent racing toward disaster. Then came the spark: the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914. Europe slid into war. Britain joined the conflict, and George V became the wartime king of the largest empire in history. The First World War challenged the monarchy like never before. Millions of British soldiers marched under George's name. He visited wounded soldiers in hospitals, traveled to the front lines, and shared the hardships of his people. His sincere concern won respect, yet the war placed immense pressure on the monarchy. Anti-German sentiments spread across the country, and the royal family descendants of German nobility faced intense criticism. In response, George made a historic decision. He abandoned the family as a Hermanname, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, and created a new royal identity, the House of Windsor. It was a symbolic act, but a powerful one. It connected the monarchy directly to the British people and helped secure its survival during the most turbulent era in modern history. The war dragged on. Lives were destroyed. Empires fell. By the time peace came in 1918, the world had changed forever. But George's role was not finished. A new storm awaited him, not from foreign battlefields, but from within the heart of his own family. PART, for 1,000 words. The Age of Revolution and Royal Survival. The end of the First World War did not bring peace to the royal families of Europe. Instead, it unleashed a wave of revolution. Thrones collapsed, one after another. Centuries-old dynasties disappeared almost overnight. The Romanovs in Russia were executed. The Habsburgs in Austria were dethroned. The German Kaiser fled into exile. Kings, once believed untouchable, were suddenly powerless. George V watched all of this with deep shock. Many of the fallen monarchs were his own cousins. Nicholas II of Russia was not only a relative, but a close friend. Their families had vacationed together. Their children had played side by side. But in 1918, the Bolsheviks executed Nicholas, his wife, and all their children. The news devastated George. For the rest of his life, he carried that grief like a private shadow. The fall of so many European monarchies made one thing clear: if the British monarchy wanted to survive, it had to change. George understood the danger. He recognized that the survival of the crown depended on staying close to the people, not above them. He began shaping a new kind of monarchy, less imperial, more national, less distant, more human. One of the first major shifts came when he embraced public appearances, not as rare events, but as regular duties. George had always been serious about his responsibilities, but now he expanded them. He visited industrial towns, spoke with workers, attended public ceremonies, and made himself visible across the country. He knew that the monarchy could no longer exist as an ornament of empire. It had to earn the loyalty of everyday citizens. At the same time, Britain was changing socially and politically. Women gained the right to vote. Labor movements became stronger. Ireland moved toward independence. Old aristocratic privileges faded. A more democratic society was emerging, and a monarchy had to find a place within it. George adapted with discipline. He supported the idea that the monarch must remain strictly neutral, detached from party politics, but connected to the nation's identity. This philosophy became the foundation of the modern monarchy. In 1922, Ireland became the Irish Free State after decades of conflict. The dissolution of the United Kingdom in its old form was a painful but critical moment. George believed that compromise was necessary to prevent further bloodshed, and history later proved him right. Meanwhile, the empire continued to evolve. George attended the first imperial conference that began shaping the idea of a commonwealth of nations, a partnership rather than an empire. Though still symbolic at the time, this idea would eventually become one of the most important legacies of the British crown. Yet not all of George's challenges came from politics or international crises. Some came from his own family. George had 6 children, each with very different personalities. The oldest, Edward, known as David, was handsome, charming, and adored by the public. But inside the palace, he was a growing concern. Edward disliked responsibility. He avoided royal duties, resisted discipline, and pursued relationships that created tension with the court. George worried about him constantly. He confided privately to Queen Mary that Edward lacked the steadiness required to be king. For the age of revolution and royal survival, the end of the First World War did not bring peace to the royal families of Europe. Instead, it unleashed a wave of revolution. Thrones collapsed, one after another. Centuries-old dynasties disappeared almost overnight. The Romanovs in Russia were executed. The Habsburgs in Austria were dethroned. The German Kaiser fled into exile. Kings, once believed untouchable, were suddenly powerless. George V watched all of this with deep shock. Many of the fallen monarchs were his own cousins. Nicholas II of Russia was not only a relative, but a close friend. Their families had vacationed together. Their children had played side by side. But in 1918, the Bolsheviks executed Nicholas, his wife, and all their children. The news devastated George. For the rest of his life, he carried that grief like a private shadow. The fall of so many European monarchies made one thing clear. If the British monarchy wanted to survive, it had to change. George understood the danger. He recognized that the survival of the crown depended on staying close to the people, not above them. He began shaping a new kind of monarchy, less imperial, more national, less distant, more human. One of the first major shifts came when he embraced public appearances, not as rare events, but as regular duties. George had always been serious about his responsibilities, but now he expanded them. He visited industrial towns, spoke with workers, attended public ceremonies, and made himself visible across the country. He knew that the monarchy could no longer exist as an ornament of empire. It had to earn the loyalty of everyday citizens. At the same time, Britain was changing socially and politically. Women gained the right to vote. Labor movements became stronger. Ireland moved toward independence. Old aristocratic privileges faded. A more democratic society was emerging, and the monarchy had to find a place within it. George adapted with discipline. He supported the idea that the monarch must remain strictly neutral, detached from party politics, but connected to the nation's identity. This philosophy became the foundation of the modern monarchy. In 1922, Ireland became the Irish Free State after decades of conflict. The dissolution of the United Kingdom in its old form was a painful but critical moment. George believed that compromise was necessary to prevent further bloodshed, and history later proved him right. Meanwhile, the empire continued to evolve. George attended the first imperial conference that began shaping the idea of a commonwealth of nations, a partnership, rather than an empire. Though still symbolic at the time, this idea would eventually become one of the most important legacies of the British crown. Yet not all of George's challenges came from politics or international crises. Some came from his own family. George had 6 children, each with very different personalities. The oldest, Edward, known as David, was handsome, charming, and adored by the public. But inside the palace, he was a growing concern. Edward disliked responsibility. He avoided royal duties, resisted discipline, and pursued relationships that created tension with the court. George worried about him constantly. He confided privately to Queen Mary that Edward lacked the steadiness required to be king. His second son, Albert, later King George VI, was the opposite. Shy, serious, and often struggling with a speech impediment. Albert lacked Edward's glamour but possessed a strong sense of duty. George respected him deeply. George's daughters brought him comfort. Mary, his only daughter, was loyal and dependable. His younger sons, Henry, George, and John, were each unique, but the family endured painful losses, especially with John, who suffered from epilepsy and died young. The king mourned him quietly. Publicly, the palace downplayed John's condition due to the era's stigma around illnesses. Despite these personal tragedies, George continued reshaping the monarchy for a modern world. For the King's Silver Jubilee in 1935, the nation celebrated him with an enthusiasm few monarchs had ever received. The public saw him as a symbol of stability on anchor during decades of upheaval. The Jubilee demonstrated that the monarchy, once threatened by war and revolution, was securely back in the hearts of the British people. But behind the grand celebrations, George's health was deteriorating. Years of stress, worry, and smoking had worn him down. Physicians noted his declining strength, though he continued working with determination. In his final years, George felt uneasy about the future of the crown. He feared what might happen when his eldest son, Edward, inherited the throne. Edward's relationships with American socialite Wallis Simpson and his casual attitude toward royal duty alarmed the king. In 1936, a year before his death, George predicted with quiet certainty, "After I am gone, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months. He was right, but that crisis belonged to the next generation. The son who threatened the throne by the early 1930s. King George V had witnessed the British monarchy survive World War, revolution, and the collapse of empires. But now, he faced a danger far more intimate, far more personal, one that came not from foreign powers or political turmoil, but from inside his own bloodline. This threat had a name: Edward, Prince of Wales. Edward was everything a modern prince was expected to be: handsome, fashionable, adored by newspapers, and admired by millions across the world. Crowds lined the streets just to catch a glimpse of him. Women fainted at his appearance. Men wanted to dress like him. Every headline called him the world's most eligible bachelor. But behind the dazzling smile and effortless charm, George V saw something the public did not: a dangerous lack of discipline. While the king valued structure, duty, and routine, Edward craved excitement, emotion, and personal freedom. He resented protocol. He disliked official responsibilities. He toured the empire, but privately he complained that royal duties were suffocating. He was the first British royal to be treated like a celebrity, and he loved it. George V watched with growing alarm. What troubled him most was Edward's romantic life. The prince surrounded himself with married women, wealthy socialites, and glamorous figures from high society. These relationships were considered harmless indulgences until Wallis Simpson entered his life. Wallis was an American woman, twice divorced, sharp-tongued, bold, and confident. She didn't behave like the demure ladies of the British aristocracy. She challenged Edward, advised him, and made him feel understood. To Edward, she was not a Scanduzi with salvation. To the king and the government, she was a catastrophe waiting to happen. As Edward's obsession with Wallis intensified, palace officials reported that he spent less time preparing for kingship and more time seeking private meetings, traveling with her, and placing her above state business. Ambassadors warned that foreign governments were already whispering about the dangerous influence of an American divorcee over the future king. George V tried to intervene gently at first. He hoped Edward would come to his senses, but the prince only grew more defiant. The king confided to Queen Mary, "He will break the heart of any woman he marries, except perhaps this American." By 1933, the situation was no longer a private family issue. Prime ministers, bishops, and advisors all feared what would happen when Edward ascended the throne. Divorced women were socially unacceptable and high society led. Alone in Buckingham Palace, the Church of England, of which the monarch was the supreme governor, strictly opposed remarriage after divorce. A king could not marry a divorced woman whose former husbands were still living. It would create a constitutional crisis. Yet Edward refused to end the relationship. His desire for personal happiness outweighed any sense of royal duty, and that was the one thing his father could not accept. By 1935, as King George V celebrated his silver jubilee, he was adored by the people. His decades of service had earned him immense respect. The public loved him not for glamour, but for stability. Far from a distant emperor, he was now seen as a father figure of the nation. But even during the Jubilee celebrations, George's eyes often darkened with worry. The king was aging, his health failing, his strength fading, but his concern for the future of the monarchy only intensified. He discussed his worries with close advisors. Many of them returned with the same uneasy question: what will happen when Edward becomes king? During one private moment, George spoke words that would later become prophetic. "After I am gone, that boy will ruin himself in less than a year." Only his second son, Albert, seemed to understand the gravity of their father's warnings. Albert, quiet and gentle, suffered from a stammer and anxiety. Yet he had a deep sense of duty, one that mirrored George V's own devotion. But Albert was the second in line, not the heir. George often found comfort in conversations with Albert, perhaps sensing that one day he might be needed for more than anyone yet realized. Despite his worries, the king continued performing his role with unshakable determination. The monarchy had survived too much under his reign for him to abandon his responsibilities now. He carried on with state papers, meetings, and ceremonies, even as he grew tired and thin. His voice weakened, but his authority never did. Still, as the months passed, the cracks in his health became harder to ignore. He struggled to breathe. He coughed uncontrollably. Decades of heavy smoking had ravaged his lungs. Physicians urged him to rest, but George refused. He believed that a king must work until his final breath. He attended Christmas at Sandringham in 1935 with his entire family. Edward arrived glowing with confidence, Wallis waiting nearby in secret. Albert stayed close to his father, worried not just about his health but about the storm he knew would break after the king died. During those final weeks, George spent hours in reflection. He had guided Britain through war. He had transformed the monarchy for a modern age. He had rebuilt faith in the crown after revolutions destroyed kings across Europe. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was what would come after. On the night of January 20th, 1936, King George V spoke his final recorded words. They were simple, quiet, and full of the dry humor he was known for. "God damn you." A remark to his nurse, who insisted he take his sedative. Hours later, he slipped into unconsciousness. The nation held its breath, and before dawn broke, the king who had steadied an empire, who had carried the crown through its most dangerous century, took his final breath. George V was gone, but his warning remained, and the crisis he feared was about to erupt. 6. The final echo of a dying empire. When King George VI took the throne in the wake of his brother's abdication, the British monarchy stood at a crossroads. The world was changing faster than anyone in the royal household could fully grasp. Empires were collapsing, dictators were rising, nations were bracing for storms that would reshape the 20th century. Yet even as history rumbled in the distance, one truth became clear. Everything King George VI would face was shaped by the man who came before him. This final chapter begins with George V's legacy, echoing through a world shifting toward war, nationalism, and the slow fading of imperial power. George VI inherited a kingdom wounded by scandal, uncertain of its future, and standing at the edge of global conflict. He possessed none of the confidence Edward had flaunted, none of the charisma the public once adored, but he had something far more valuable, an instinct for duty that mirrored his father's own. He studied George V's letters. He listened to the old advisors. He asked repeatedly, "What would my father do?" The answers soon became clear. The approach of war throughout the late 1930s, Hitler's rise, spread fear across Europe. George VI knew the threat was real, but he also knew Britain needed unity, real unity, not a king who chased personal desires. He sought to rebuild trust, attending public events, speaking to citizens, strengthening ties with the Commonwealth. Everywhere he went, he carried the quiet, steady manner that his father had perfected. The people responded. Slowly, the monarchy regained its dignity. But when Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the peaceful effort ended. Britain was forced into another war, a war far more catastrophic than the one George V had lived through. George VI prepared to address the nation by radio, just as his father had done during World War I, but unlike George V, the new king struggled with his speech. His stammer made public speaking a torment. Every syllable felt like a battle. His hands shook. His breath caught in his throat. His entire childhood fear returned, but he also remembered something his father once told him. The strength of a king lies not in perfection, but in perseverance. And so George VI pushed forward. His first wartime broadcast wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was honest, human. A king fighting to find his voice, while asking his nation to stand strong. Millions listened. Millions believed again. In that moment, the monarchy regained something far greater than prestige. It regained the hearts of the people. The royal family under fire, unlike previous monarchs who retreated to safe country estates during war. George VI refused to abandon London. He insisted that he and Queen Elizabeth remain at Buckingham Palace even as bombs rained down on the capital. When the palace itself was hit by German air raids, the Queen famously remarked, "Now we can look the East End in the face." The British people saw courage in their king and queen. Not distance, not luxury, not privilege, but shared suffering. And that bond between monarch and nation had been forged years earlier by George V's example of wartime leadership. Even as the Blitz ravaged the city, the king toured bombed neighborhoods, raising morale, comforting survivors, and standing among ruins that once held families, shops, and dreams. Photographs of him walking through smoke and debris became symbols of resilience. But no moment defined his leadership more than one. When he visited troops preparing for the D-Day invasion, young soldiers, many barely 20, stood at attention, faces tight with fear and determination. George VI moved slowly down the line, stopping to speak with each man. He knew what awaited them across the channel. He knew thousands would never return. The king's voice was quiet, steady, just as his father's had been in World War I. When you fight, he told them, you fight for all of us. Victory. And the death of empire when World War II ended in 1945. Victory came with heavy cost. Britain was financially exhausted. Cities lay in ashes. Millions were grieving. And across the world, colonies demanded independence. The sun was setting on the British Empire. George VI felt this loss personally. He had grown up believing the empire was eternal. His father had worked tirelessly to protect and strengthen it. But now, the winds of change could no longer be stopped. India gained independence. Africa demanded self-rule. The Caribbean sought autonomy. The word empire began to fade. A new word took its place. Commonwealth. Community built, not on conquests, but partnership. This transformation would one day define the reign of George VI's daughter, Elizabeth II. But its beginnings were rooted in the last wishes of George V, who had quietly predicted that empires built by force would not survive the modern age. What must endure, he said once, is the crown, not the empire behind it. His prophecy proved true. A father's legacy. By the early 1950s, George VI's health began to fail. Decades of duty, stress, and smoking had taken their toll. He grew thinner, weaker, exhausted. Yet he pressed on, just as his father had done during his final years. The last major act of his reign was one filled with symbolism. He saw his daughter, Princess Elizabeth, prepare to become queen. The monarchy was ready to pass into a new era, one George V had hoped for, one he had shaped through discipline, modernization, and resilience. When George VI died in 1952, the world mourned him not as a glamorous king, but as a steady, humble figure who guided Britain through war and the collapse of empire. His death marked a transition, not just from one reign to another, but from an age of empire to an age of global unity and diplomacy. His daughter, now Queen Elizabeth II, would inherit not the empire her grandfather once ruled, but a world transformed by sacrifice, war, and the slow dismantling of colonial power. But she would also inherit something far more enduring. A monarchy rebuilt by George V, tested by Edward VIII, saved by George VI, and prepared for the future through decades of struggle. The last whisper of empire had faded, but the crown remained, and it remained because of the king who steadied it through its most dangerous century.